So at the end of chapter 13, kind of finish up these first section of parables in chapter 13 dealing with the kingdom. And it says in verse 53, and when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished, and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household. And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. I think this is an important thing to kind of highlight as we move on. What we've been emphasizing through Matthew is Jesus did what we couldn't do, right? And so there's this great emphasis on the Israelites and their failings and the way that Jesus fulfills that. And so you get several points of reference for that. The Sermon on the Mount, where he talks specifically about the law, his baptism, all these sorts of parallels to the Israelites. So you get all these lessons. But we also see constantly throughout this amazing coupling of his divinity and his humanity. And we see the way that he was so very normal, and we see the way that he was so very divine. And sections like this, I think, are important for the whole story to see the way that people responded to him. Because here is a man who is performing miracles, who is teaching with authority. Here he is in the synagogue, and he's teaching, and they're astonished at what he said, which isn't the first time that people have been astonished at what Jesus said. But here in his hometown, they're in disbelief of it because they know him. They're like, we know who he is. We know where he came from. We know who his family is. And so they doubt, right? And, he says, they took offense at him, but Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household. He was too familiar. He was too normal. They knew who he was, and so they took offense at it. And there's something that is maybe comforting about that, about the character of Jesus, as weird as that may be, that he was just Jesus, that they knew where he came from. And the real comfort is that although they rejected him now, we see later his brother, James, writing an epistle, being a prominent member of the New Testament church. We see his family believing in him later. But there's this comfort in this change that takes place over people over the course of his life as they establish who he is. I mean, it's like, we often say to young people when they get married, you need to move away from home. Get married, move away from home, then come back later, right? Establish who you are as a family, away from the people that watched you grow up. That we recognize, I think, some value in that, because that transition from childhood to adulthood is hard anyway, but when it's around people that knew you as a child, it's a little bit more difficult, right? Because they still see you as the little kid. And, I don't know, personally, my wife and I always kind of struggled with that when we go back home for Christmas. And it's like you have older brothers, and they're like teasing you and making fun of you for what you did when you were 4. And it's like, but now you have a family, right? Like now you have kids. Now you're like the man of the house, and your brothers are still picking at you from things you did when you were 3. And obviously my wife takes offense at that. My kids don't really notice, they're off playing. But, it's like this sort of thing, right? And you see that even in Jesus, that there's this barrier that people had to the way that they perceived him that they had to overcome. And it's an interesting note that that's thrown in there. As we transition to chapter 14, I really don't like first part of chapter 14, and a part of me wishes we could just skip the story. There's nothing pleasant about this story of John the Baptist, but it's here, and there's some lessons we can learn from it. So let's jump into Matthew 14, verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." And then we get the reason why he thought this. For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guest, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother, and his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. It's like about as vile sort of like picture you can imagine of like immorality, of licentiousness, like weird sense of oath, right? Like here's Herod. So this is one of the many sons of the Herod who tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby. So here comes the house of Herod coming up again as like the foil to the story of Jesus. And John the Baptist is preaching against him, saying this isn't the real king, right? There's someone coming who will be the real king. So he's preaching against him, and then he starts to condemn him because of this behavior that he has, where he took his brother's wife, right? He's like, this isn't your real king. The real king, the Messiah, he's not going to be somebody who does these sorts of immoral things, and he preaches against him. Well, Herod, of course, doesn't like that, so he seizes him and puts him in prison. But again, doesn't seem that strong-willed of a human because he's afraid of the rights of the people and worried about those sorts of things, which doesn't scream somebody who has this, So you have all these sorts of issues here with this guy. Puts John in prison, doesn't know what to do with him. And then at a feast, he gets his niece, his brother's wife's daughter, right, to dance before him and like inflame his passions to where he promises her anything that she wants, which obviously is foolish for so many reasons. And then, of course, this girl, vile enough to participate in these things and whatever else, urged by her mother, demands something even more vile, and they come and display the head of John the Baptist on a platter in front of a crowd as like a show and tell. It's disgusting behavior, right? Like the amount of immorality that exists here is difficult to read about, difficult to think about. And yet that's the nature of the world, right? Like that's the nature of Herod, that's the nature of the royalty of the day, that's the nature of the things that Jesus is trying to redeem the world from. And so you get this whole story. And this is presented here, one, because now, like it says at the beginning of the chapter, Herod is worried because here's Jesus performing miracles. And he thinks that it's John the Baptist come back to haunt him, right? Like there's some sort of weird guilt here that he has, and he's worried about Jesus now because of this. But it really also sets up, I think, this story, the next section of Scripture, because it continues on in verse 13. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew. And so, although, my Bible and probably a lot of our Bibles have a different header here for Jesus feeding the 5,000, the text makes it clear that this occurs right after the other thing. Now, this whole chapter reads that way. Verse 21 to 22, he says, immediately he made the disciples get in the boat. Kind of continues on. I think if you try to look at like the harmony of the gospel and stuff, and you get one of those books that talks about those things, and you try to lay out the story, I think that they have a different layout, probably of the order of events if you tried to do this historically. I don't want to get into all that this morning. I think it's worthwhile looking at the way that Matthew laid this out, because Matthew's making a particular point here in connecting these stories. And he connects Jesus' hearing of this event, this horrible event of John the Baptist, with what he does. Jesus hears it. Verse 13, he withdrew himself from a boat into a desolate place by himself. And I think that that's reasonable, right, and understandable. Here Jesus hears about this horrible scene that's occurred with John the Baptist, and he goes to be by himself. And I think we all can relate to that feeling of sadness, loneliness, depression, hearing horrible news, and you just want a moment, right? To pray, to think about it, to process it is the way that we talk about that. And so here Jesus goes to a desolate place to be by himself, to mourn John's death, to perhaps face the confrontation of what he's going to go through. Here is his cousin, the forerunner, the one who came before him, the one who he just a couple chapters ago said, none have been born of woman mightier than John the Baptist, greater than John the Baptist. And here he's been killed, and he knows that that's his fate, to be put to death as well by the same sort of evil cabal of people. And so there's a lot of things there that Jesus wants to go and be alone and process and think through and pray about. And what I think is amazing about this next part of the story is the great lesson that Jesus teaches us in that moment. Because we think about Jesus and his love and we sacrifice on the cross. We think about Philippians 2, emptied himself, of his divinity, takes on the form of flesh. And we have all these big descriptions of who Jesus is, the love that he showed, all these things, and they're really hard to process. It's too big. Well, here's something that's big but smaller, and I think that we can contextualize a little bit better. The kind of mournful sorrow of wanting to be alone. And within that same verse it says, he's in a desolate place by himself, but when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. Here he is, he wants to be alone, and he can't get away from the people. And he goes ashore, and he saw a great crowd. And of course, you have it in front of you. Probably read it. I mean, you know the header, you know what happens. But if it's you, and the great crowd comes in that moment, what do you do? What do you want to do? I think, very small scale. It's like something happens. I don't know, you break your ankle, you get hurt, whatever. You come to church and you're like, everybody's going to ask about the ankle, Like nobody knows about it yet, but you've got a boot on or you got crutches and it's like, oh boy, I'm going to have to answer this question 50 times today. And you're like, oh man, and you got to that's fine. It's not like it's that big of a deal. And you're grateful that everybody's concerned and asks about why you're on crutches, But there's also a little bit of that, we all know I'm hurt, right? Let me just come to church, right? Maybe we have a little bit of that in us. And so I say that almost as like a humorous way of kind of articulating this feeling that Jesus has. You just want to be alone, and here these people come. But it isn't even that they're coming because they're concerned about him. They're like, Jesus, we heard about your cousin. Jesus, we're so, are you okay, right? That's not why they're there. Like you come to church and you're on crutches and people are like, are you okay? Can I do something for you? No, they come to Jesus and they're like, perform a miracle, right? Like whatever it is. And when he sees them, his reaction isn't to flee further away. It's what? He had compassion on them and he healed their sick. It isn't that he healed a couple of their sick. It isn't that he healed one of them to appease them and demonstrate his power and then he left. It isn't so that I have the power to forgive sins, I'm going to heal this one person. Okay, I've done my job, I'm going to leave. He just healed their sick. All of their sick is the implication in my mind. He healed their sick, and then now it's evening. So he spent all day healing them, talking with them. And the disciples came to him. And this is interesting too. The disciples come and they seem to be thoughtful, right? Like they're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. And they say, this is a desolate place and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. They're thinking, look, there's not food here. This isn't going to last. We need to take care of these people. We need to send them away and make sure that we're thoughtful about what's going on. It seems to be a pretty earnest, thoughtful kind of response, right? But Jesus looks at them, as he typically does, and kind of points out that they missed the point. He says, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. And they're like, oh boy, I thought we were, we don't have any food. But they're like, well, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. We don't have much, but we'll give them what we have. I'll give up my meal for them. It's not much. And it's pretty remarkable because they don't get it, right? They don't understand what's happening. And so you can kind of rebuke them maybe for that. But really, I think the lesson is, look at these men that are being thoughtful of Jesus, being thoughtful of the crowds. They know that they need to be fed, are trying to be considerate of them, and they're willing to give of their, small meal to these people. And there's a pretty powerful lesson there of you give what you can. right? And it may not be much. You may not be able to offer much, but you see a need and you give what you can. And what does Jesus do with such a meager amount? Well, he does everything, right? He said, bring them here to me. And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, said a blessing, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So there was just 5,000 men. 10,000 people, 15,000 people there. That's a lot of people. They all fed out of this, lunch somebody had. And there's a pretty cool lesson there about we offer the little bit we have and look at what God can do with it. Look at how God can take such a small amount and multiply it. Increase the blessing to all these others. Any comments, questions? Sorry, I've been going pretty hard. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. And it's such an encouraging thing because it's easy to think, I can't do much, it's not worth it. I don't know. I think we talk about that. We're familiar with that kind of point, but to actually consider it, to try and apply that, think about the small things we can do and the way that they can have a trickle-on effect, have a profound impact on somebody else. I don't know, it's pretty, helpful to me to see like a pretty real example of that. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and there's something, like I said, like particularly impressive to me about that because it's somewhat relatable in a way that a lot of the example that Jesus provides is hard to relate to. This is one that I think is a little bit easier. How do you deal with others in those kind of moments? But it isn't just about an example for the way that we behave or the way that we should act towards others. I think it's also just an example of his character. Like I think there's a lesson there that drives us, but I think there's also a pretty powerful, profound lesson there about the way that God perceives us. That if Jesus in that moment sees this crowd and has this kind of compassion on them, that's inherent in who he is. Like that's like the default setting, right? Because you kind of find out who you are when you don't have time to react. You know what I mean? When it's just you're confronted with something. You figure out what kind of character you have in those like kind of shocking moments you have to respond. And it's like here Jesus is not expecting the crowds, as far as we can tell. He's in a desolate place. And yet here they are upon him. And it's not anger. It's not frustration because of what he needed. It's immediately compassion on them. Look at how much they need. Look at how lost they are. Look at how much they suffer. And if that's who he is, even in a moment of sorrow, like, who is he now when he is seated at the right hand of the throne of heaven, looking down on us, interceding for us? You know, and so it's a lesson of like his understanding of the human condition, his understanding of sorrow, and yet it's also a remarkable statement of the compassion he has for us. And so, like, we pray and we ask for something, and we're going through a difficult time, and we want something, we're hungry, we're thirsty, we're sad, and you pray, and who are you praying to? You're praying to this guy, like to Jesus, to the one who has this response to the crowds coming to him. And I think that's really important to spend some time like just considering that that's who he is. And we don't always get the response to a prayer that we want. But I think if we understand and appreciate the compassion and the love that he has for us, it allows us to handle even the disappointing response, for lack of a better term, with the sort of appreciation that we should have. Because it's not out of a disrespect or a non-caring sort of nature that Jesus doesn't respond. He's compassionate and he loves us. And ultimately he cares not just about feeding us, but saving us, redeeming us. And that's the direction that the whole gospel is going. And I think that's a big deal. Any other? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, really difficult. I mean, in John, he talks about the Son of Man will be lifted up. He seems to have some understanding that it might even be crucifixion. But how much of all of that is based on perfect understanding of the prophets? How much of that is divine? I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's one that I don't know that I can answer. But whether he understood what was going to happen to John or whether he was shocked by it, I think in either case, the amount of sorrow he shows is like reasonable, or maybe more so, I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah. 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 How much of that? I would imagine, I might venture to say, and this is speculation, that at the very least it makes more real what was going to happen to him. Like we face our own mortality in different ways, at different times as we get older, experience things, and like surely this is one of those moments that makes that a little bit more real to him, I would imagine. You gonna say something, Derek? Or how much Jesus knew before they told him, I guess was Jay's question. But yeah, it's interesting. So any more thoughts before we jump to the next section? So we get it immediately. Again, I think Matthew's trying to tie these things together. So immediately after he feeds them, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. So now he gets his moment, right? Like now crowds are away. He sends the disciples away. He's taking care of the people. Now he has this moment on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But Verse 24, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. And so we'll get to verse 26 in a second, but it's like he gets interrupted again almost. Maybe he gets enough time. Maybe he got enough prayer. Like that's all he needed was a few hours, whatever. But it's still interesting to me, the but statement, the fact that this is in the middle of the night. It was already getting towards evening when he feeds them. Now it's at night. He's praying by himself, but the disciples are in trouble. So once again, he leaves what he's doing and goes to them walking on the sea because the boat is beaten by the wind and all these sorts of things. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. Verse 26, but when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. There's a lot of elements to this that are interesting to me. There is the fact that some of them are seasoned fishermen on the sea, and yet the winds and the storm is so much that they're terrified. The fact that Jesus comes to them in the middle of the night walking on the water, essentially to come save them, is fascinating. The response of Peter to say, well, if it's you, let me come out there. I want to walk on the water. And I don't really understand what Peter's thinking. Like, if I'm honest, I don't, is he think it's cool? I want to try that? Is he well, then prove to me you're Jesus? Or is it I don't know. I don't know what would ever possess anyone to think, well, if Jesus can do it, I can do it. That whole part of this is I can't. Maybe some of you can. Maybe some of you are that way. That it's oh, that person just jumped out of a plane. I'm going to jump out of the plane. I don't know. Maybe that's just a personality type. But anyway, Peter's let me come out, and Jesus is okay, come on. Peter hops out. He's walking on the water, and then he sees the wind and the waves, which is also fascinating because it's he didn't recognize that they were there before. I think the idea is that then he started to realize what was happening. And maybe his impulsiveness caught up to him, might be the way to read that. And he looks around, he sees the wind of the waves, and he begins to sink. And I think it's interesting that he begins to sink as opposed to he just drops to the bottom of the water. I don't know how much to parse into that language of the scene to see it as he's slowly sinking, as his faith slowly sinks or something. I don't know. But Jesus grabs him and saves him and chastises him for his lack of faith, which is also kind of humorous to me because he jumped out of the boat. He jumped out of the boat. So I don't know. So a lot of really kind of interesting parts of the story to me. But maybe the most relevant or practical part is Peter gets out of the boat, walks to Jesus, and then he sees the wind and the waves. And as a preacher, as a Bible class teacher, there's no analogy that is more apt, right? There's nothing more vivid that we could use. As you go out in the world and you're excited, but then you see the wind and the waves and they start to cause you to lose your faith and to sink, right? It becomes this kind of beautiful allegory almost for the Christian life. And we get several of these throughout the story. Not that it is an allegory, but we kind of see the application, don't we? How easy is it to go out and think that you're going to do something and that you're all in and you're excited about what you're going to accomplish, and you quickly become discouraged by the wind and the waves, by the chastisement of the wicked, by the mockery of those around you, by your own doubt that sinks in because it hasn't accomplished what you thought it would accomplish. And I think that, coupled with the previous story, is pretty important, right? They just take their basket of food, and Jesus turns that basket of food into feeding 5,000 people. And we go out into the world and we think we're going to accomplish great things. We think that we can do incredible things, and then you don't. And we undersell the value of what God can do with so little. I think is part of that. And so I think it's interesting that these two stories are coupled together, that see what God can do with so little, and to notice how easy it is to grow discouraged with what we're trying to do. I don't know. What are your thoughts, comments? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting too. Maybe this is a fair analogy, but it's like you watch a movie and they always have like a training montage in like a lot of movies. Think about like Star Wars with Yoda. And like here's Luke and he's training really hard, and then it's like the X-Wing sinks into the swamp and Yoda's like, use the Force to lift it out or whatever, and he like tries like, I can't, it's too big. And then Yoda shows it and he picks it up. And then he's like, I don't believe it. He's like, oh, that's why you fail, right? And there's this whole thing. And like you have these training montage where it's like the person fails, and it's like they have to pick themselves back up. You know what I mean? Like you got to try harder. You know, you're like Rocky running on the beach. You just got to keep running till you beat Apollo Creed. Like whatever it is, like we have this attitude of like you've got to fix it, right? Like you've got to pick yourself up. You've got to go the next step or figure the next piece out. And yet in this story, here's Peter who's supposed to have this faith. He doubts, he sinks. Jesus just grabs him by the hand. Maybe that's not a fair comparison, but it seems like if I was writing the story, you know, you'd be chastised. And it's like, believe, Peter, believe, you can do it. And then he has to like climb back in the boat and try again, you know. But Jesus just grabs him by the hand and lifts him out and puts him in the boat. And I think that that's interesting because there's not this attitude within the Bible of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. Like that's not a biblical concept. That's like an American individualistic concept. That's like John Wayne, you know? Like that's a John Wayne sort of idea. Pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. The biblical idea is allow Jesus to help you back into the boat. And like that's where the faith comes in. Is like Peter didn't trust Jesus. It's not that Peter lacks something, right? It's that Peter didn't understand Jesus. Jesus isn't going to let you sink and die in the water. Like that's not who Jesus is. And so it's almost less like he's lacking something and more like he just misunderstood something. That our faith is really just a belief in the faithfulness of God. That we just believe that God's going to do what he said he's going to do. And when Jesus calls us out of the boat onto the water, to sink and not have enough faith is to say that you don't believe that Jesus is going to take care of you. It's that you don't trust the faithfulness of Jesus. And so really, even our faith is something that gets cast back on Jesus. And that's the misunderstanding there. These people come to Jesus desperate for anything. You know, they need something and they think that Jesus can provide it. And here's Peter on the water, and he kind of believes that Jesus is going to take care of him, but then he also doesn't fully believe that Jesus is going to take care of him. And that's the misunderstanding. You know, for a long time and as a kid, you know, you think about faith as like this thing that I have to have. That like my faith is like my thing. And like it's a testament to who I am. Like, and I'm going to build my strong faith. And that's the thing that's like so important. And I remember, I think I've used this analogy before. Like I remember praying for things as a kid, and I'm like, this is a test of my faith. And it would like be something ridiculous. that like God would grant me this. But if I believe in faith, I can move mountains with my faith. So like I believe. So like let this be a test, God. It was like my way of like trying to manipulate God as like a 10-year-old to get whatever I wanted, right? Give me a new puppy or whatever it was. And we think about faith as this like achievement thing that we have to gain, that we have to achieve this level of faith. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Like faith isn't like an achievement. It's not like a statistic in a role-playing game where you level it up and you have a number and you're trying to get to 100 max faith. That's not what it is. Faith is simply an understanding of who God is. And it's his faithfulness that saves us. And I think we kind of mix that up sometimes. Like we should trust in God more, and yeah, I guess you can call that faith, but it's not an achievement, it's an understanding of his character. And Jesus reaches down in the water and grabs Peter by the hand and puts him back in the boat. Jesus is also the same one who, when Peter denies him 3 times, goes out and asks him 3 times to feed a sheep, to restore him. Like Peter, who denies him 3 times and like the lowest, darkest moment of Jesus' life, and Jesus is there and sees him and looks at him. Like Jesus still reaches into the water and picks him up and puts him back in the boat. Because that's who Jesus is. And that's what we need to understand. That it's not our achievement or our thing. It's just who God is. And do you believe that God is that way? Do you believe that Jesus is that way? Because he's there to pick you up and put you back in the boat. Regardless of whatever the winds or the waves or whatever the thing was that caused you to sink, that's why he's there. Yeah.
I definitely do think that our faith does reflect back on who Jesus and God is, but I wouldn't downplay the importance of faith on the individual who has it. I mean, we saw earlier in Matthew, Jesus marveled at the centurion who had no greater faith. Like he is crediting faith or some level of stature to the faith that man had, that he could save his daughter, and that he understood authority and all of that. In Hebrews, we have a very explicit description of faith being credited to the individual who has it as righteousness. The word used is kind of like an accounting. So, I mean, faith, there obviously are two parts to it. Like, obviously, it reflects on the individual who has it and also on the individual who we are holding the faith in. It's definitely a two-way thing. But I wouldn't completely downplay just how important it is for us as individuals to work on our faith. And it does say something about the individual. I mean, we wouldn't have that language in Hebrews about basically why righteousness was credited to those individuals. So.
Yeah, sure. So here's my point, I guess. How often, and this is a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer, but how often in our lives do we try to think about building our faith as like this stat that we gain or an achievement? You know what I mean? Like my point is to try and redefine our perspective on that a little bit. So I overstated it, sure. But I think there's value in overstating it the other way, to try and overcorrect maybe what I perceive as a potential danger, in which we think that like our faith is somehow the thing that saves, or like if I have enough faith, like that's way too egocentric compared to like I think the nature of what faith should be, which is simply trust in God and who he is. And so I think your point is exactly right. Like our faith does matter. It is a statement of what we believe. There is a lot of conversation in the New Testament about the faith of individuals and those sorts of things. I think that's exactly right. And I probably overstated it. But I do want us to maybe think about it a little bit the other way too. That maybe it isn't so much about what we've achieved in our faith or how fully we believe, that maybe it's much more about God's faithfulness, and simply we need to reflect that back on him. That's kind of my point. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, there's a ditch on either side of the road, right? Ben Dickey saying. I was talking to my dad about that. He taught marriage and family for years, and we were kind of chatting about things that my granddad used to say, and he was like, people come up to me all the time about marriage and family, and he's like, it was just Ben Dickey sayings, that kind of country folky wisdom that I taught for 30 years, whatever. Kind of funny. But yeah, there's ditch on either side of the road. I think there's a way to mess it up either way. Any other thoughts? It's a good conversation. So we get to this next section, this last little section here in chapter 14. When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all the region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. It's like a little capstone on the chapter, right? So like if we kind of bounce back and look, how would you describe Jesus in this chapter? What sort of characteristics would you see or say stand out? Receptive to people who come to him, certainly. Compassionate. Like as a default setting almost. Patient, like loving, kind. I mean, and like this last little section kind of just is all those things, isn't it? We like to point out, and I think rightfully so, the really hard truths that Jesus taught. Right? Narrow is the way. We like to look at the way that he chastises the Pharisees, especially later in the book when he gets back to Jerusalem. The parables he tells that like really push certain people pretty hard, right, about forgiveness and different things. But a lot of those statements are directed towards, certainly everybody, but are directed towards those that have misunderstood, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious elite. A huge part of the gospel, particularly Matthew's gospel, fundamentally emphasizes as a baseline for Jesus what we see in chapter 14. That, yeah, there are hard truths. There is right and wrong. There is the narrow way and the broad way. Like all those things exist, right? But you can't discount or ignore the fact that almost as a rule, Jesus' default setting for the masses is compassion and love and kindness and the healing of the sick. I mean, they bring them to him. They sent around to all the region. Everybody comes. And they just implored him, reaching out just to touch the fringe of his cloak. And he freely healed all who touched. Is that because Jesus' cloak was magical? Or is it because he wanted them to be healed? It's a statement, I think, of the very nature of who God is. Like if you go to him and you implore of him, he'll heal you. And there's a lot of things that are necessary. If we want to talk about salvation, we talk about baptism, talk about the process of becoming a Christian, all these sorts of things. But on some level, we need to recognize that it's pretty simple. If you're imploring of Jesus for healing, he gives it freely. Because he looks at the lost of Israel as sheep without a shepherd. He looks at us the same way, eager to save and restore us. And I think it's a beautiful message. And certainly there's a ditch on either side of the road here too, right? We could talk about people who try to recharacterize Jesus as never punishing anyone or never demanding anything of anyone and all those sorts of things. Like that's obviously not the case. We could go the other way though and say though that Jesus demands this perfect obedience, and we have to do everything exactly right to be saved. And there's a formula and a set of rules, and like that goes too far the other way too, right? Like there's the ditch on the other side of the road there. And I think here in this chapter, the lesson that we should learn is the one that is much more of simply implore of him and he will save you. And I think we need to be reminded of the simplicity of that it's just based in the character and the love of Jesus and of God and their patient kindness towards mankind from the beginning. And that Jesus came to seek and save the lost and to heal the sick and to comfort the downtrodden. And that's what he did throughout this chapter. And I think there's a lot of kind of beautiful lessons there. Appreciate your attention and comments. We will pick up in chapter 15 next week.